everybody. Welcome to the Agronomists. And if you were expecting Sean Haney, I apologize, but actually, only a little. It's me, Lindsay Smith. I get to host the of the Agronomists. Um, that's, of course, if the rural internet gods smile upon me. So don't worry if I happen to lose you. Our guest tonight will not be left alone. We have Kara Oosterhuis in the comments. She is standing by. She will take over. But let's hope that this all works. All right. So welcome here. We are, of course, glad that you could join us. We are going to bring on our guests in just a minute, but I'm just going to run down a few things for tonight. Remember that we love interaction. We even have some swag for those who ask a question or make a comment. We've got some Real Ag hats that we'll be sending out to people that ask a question. So please make sure to hit the YouTube comment section, add a Facebook comment, or even on Twitter. And yeah, we'll try and follow along and get you that Real Ag swag. So tonight we are, and CEU credits. I can't forget. I'm going to scroll all over the place. I apologize in advance. We can, of course, you can get some continuing education credits for watching this episode. We will be sending out the link. We'll be posting it on realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow morning. And we've even got an email blast to remind you of when the show is and where to sign up for your credits every week. So by all means, after the broadcast, head on over there, sign up for that, and tomorrow morning, check back for your CEU credits. Okay, so if we're going to talk about soybeans, there's really two people we have to talk to. I'm going to bring in now our guests, Dennis Lange from Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development, and of course, Horst Bohner from OMAFRA. Welcome here, gentlemen.
Well, thanks for having us.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be here with you.
Now, so Horst, you presented last week at the Ontario Ag Conference. So how do you feel about getting into this whole, virtual presentation, online, live thing? How's that going for you?
It certainly is different than what we're used to. In this job, I've been driving all over the province for 20 years now to every church basement, it feels like, and community hall, and giving our little soybean, talk. And to have a completely different winter, it's radical for me, to be honest. It is a completely different job today than it was last year, but that's okay. I'm having a good time, and here we are again.
All right, and now Dennis, how has it been being able to stay so close to home?
I've actually I've always been a tech person, and I've always tried to be on top of the tech that's going on. And so now when we're doing all this stuff via technology, it's actually kind of cool. Stuff I wouldn't have thought I'd been able to do 5 years ago. Now I have all the toys myself, so I get to use all these things in my job. So it's actually pretty cool. I do miss not having the contact with growers that we normally would have at this time of the year, but this is what we got to do for the short term. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, I do want to mention I chose to go with just, black, so as not to upstage Dennis.
I got a black shirt on.
Well, there's pink turtles on it too, though, Dennis. I like it.
As long as I've known Dennis, he's had interesting shirts. The first time I met Dennis in Winnipeg, he had an interesting shirt, and it's never changed. That's good.
I do like it. Okay. It is always the one thing you look for when you head to an event in Manitoba is you can always find Dennis in the crowd because you just look for the Hawaiian shirts. All right. Yep. Okay, but of course we are talking soybeans. We're talking about starting right, getting this crop off to the best start possible. We're going to split this discussion, obviously, between Ontario considerations, and then, of course, for Western Canada, Manitoba specifically. But I wanted to start with, well, of course, there's lots of things that come before planting, but there's so many decisions that go into pulling the trigger and making that decision on the actual planting date. So we've got a graphic here that Dennis shared, that our producer Jay is going to share with you all, that sort of outlines all the different things that come into play when actually sort of having to make that call of when to plant. So Dennis, walk us through these quadrants here and answering this question of do I seed or not?
Well, when we're doing our presentations on soybean production, we always have these discussions about things like calendar date and soil temperature and forecast. And, we always try, and a colleague of mine kind of put this together for our presentation slide set. And what it does, it kind of looks at all the different risks that are involved, because it's not just a matter of just picking a date and saying, okay, yeah, we got to seed on this date. Or it's not just a matter of picking a soil temperature that we're going to seed at 10 degrees no matter what happens. There's also things like, the forecast coming up, and also the personal risk profile. If a grower has, 2,000 acres to plant, they're not going to wait until May 30th to start planting. By the same token, if you only have 100 acres to plant, you're not going to be planting on May 1st. So it's that personal risk and all those factors that have to be considered when you're trying to make a decision when to start and how many acres to put in. So
now, Horst, does that look similar to making that decision in Ontario as well? Does any one factor trump the others?
No, I think they do come into play. We have, over the last number of years, gone away somewhat from the soil temperature issue, and we did some experiments this year to try and again address that question because we had such a cold April. The one thing that, I do a lot of trials every year, and trials take a long time to do because there's all kinds of details. And the thing you begin to realize, if you're not planting 3,000 acres of soybeans like I'm not, is the fact that the window to plant is just so short, right? And so a lot of these things are academic. In other words, if the ground is fit, we don't really sit around on our hands and say, well, should we plant today or tomorrow? We just drive, right? And so certainly there is this thing that if you're past a certain calendar date and the ground is fit, you just go, right? You ignore everything else. You just go.
Well, and realistically, at some point, the clock runs out, right? So the later we get in the season, I think the easier it is to make the call to go. You just know it's not necessarily in perfect conditions sometimes, and you just have to go. Now, we are going to later in the program, Horst, we've got a video that you did with our own Bernd Tobin that was filmed in May of last year when conditions were really cool. And we've got some really great follow-up work from that as well that you're going to share. So I can't wait to look at that. But we are going to sort of set the stage for this discussion. We're going to go to our first clip, and it's with Eric Richter of Syngenta Canada. And it's a lengthy clip. I'll warn everybody now, but you gotta hang on to it. In that he talks about, if the theoretical yield of soybeans is 300 bushels, what is the sort of lofty goal for Ontario? And if that's 80 bushels an acre, how do we get there? And so he sort of puts that together. So let's watch that clip, and then we're going to regroup and discuss. So everybody, here we go. This is Eric Richter in our soybean school with Bernd Tobin.
Now, you kicked off your presentation with, the idea that soybean growers, you have to believe in the yield potential. The yield potential is 80 bushels. Just that was your number, and we saw 53, 54 bushels here in Ontario this year. I think growers should believe.
I think it's important, though, to clarify from a realistic yield goal, 80 is achievable, but the genetic potential from that aspect, Bern, it's much higher. 200, 300, we can argue what it is, but my point in the presentation was to just try to get growers to understand and truly start to believe that it's more than 50.
Yeah. The old saying, you've said it a lot of times over the years, that, soybeans, we can't manage them like scavengers of the past. We really need to manage them like corn.
There's a number of things that are similar between the two crops, and certainly if we're going after those big yields, we have to feed our soybean crop. We have to feed it. It's often been labeled as a scavenger crop, and I think we've worked hard as an industry to dispel that myth and get growers really saying, I'm going to grow 70, 80 bushel beans, and I'm going to fertilize for that so that we don't get into the problem of nutrient removal from our soil bank.
Yeah. Now, we've often heard the term picket fence corn, right? Picket fence stand.
Yes.
You like to use the term picket fence soybeans.
That's
because stand establishment is so key.
And I think really what I'm trying to do there, if there's one thing that is similar between the two crops, to unlock that genetic potential between each and every plant that's within those plants, we have to have those plants growing as equals. And when we get one plant that's much taller or more advanced than another plant, the corn producers, corn growers, and researchers clearly identified that you get this competition. And so in soybeans, I call it the runt factor, and that larger plant hogs and really does scavenge and pull nutrients and resources away from those weaker plants. That's not what we want to have happen. To unlock genetic potential on a plant-by-plant basis, we need to have them spaced and emerge uniformly.
Now, you also talked about soil health. Soil health matters, and you've seen that so much.
That's right.
I guess in the last decade, for sure.
I've seen soil health issues for a few decades. Back in my forage days in the 80s, I think actually we were a little more aware of it. I think the longer-term producers started to realize the impact, and we've gone through a couple generations, and we're back around now understanding soil health and how important it is for long-term profitability and sustainability. And the soybean
setting
plant,
up those roots.
That's it. The soybean plant is a key indicator. It's like the canary in the coal mine, in the sense that if you're having problems with soil health, one of the very first crops that'll show that is soybeans. Your yields will plateau. We can fertilize our way to some big yields in corn, even wheat, but in soybeans, just simply throwing fertilizer in the field is not going to get the job done. We need to have healthy soil, and we need to maximize root growth. Roots equal yield.
You always say genetics first in your conversation.
Yes.
It starts with genetics first, and genetics, yield obviously, but disease package as well. Part of that.
That's right, and genetics first. There's no perfect variety. I'll put that out there first. But what we're trying to help growers with is to match up the genetic package with that growing environment, field by field if possible, or even zone by zone. But we'll start with field by field. And so there's a strong interaction, G by E, with soil type. Clay beans, sand beans, loam beans. We'd all like the beans that move across clay, loam, and sand. But if they can position accordingly and pick the genetics to match soil type, they're better for it. But the second part is diseases by soil type. It's really important to understand that in certain environments, the growers more are predisposed to certain diseases, i.e. clay and phytophthora, high-producing loams and white mold, those types of things. And so getting the right variety, genetics first, soil and disease, and to get that what we'll call a disease shield. So it's a little bit more defensive, but that helps unlock genetic potential, protect genetic potential, and gives consistency as well year to year.
Now, one of the things, you had a list of 10 here today, and I haven't got time to go through them all, but one that really called out to me, and I'm hearing more and more about, is canopy management.
Yes.
Do we have bushing beans? Do we have pencil beans? Are we seeing too much light? Managing that canopy is key.
So we can talk about stand establishment and getting the right population, but canopy management, I think, is an area where, as a grower, as an industry, trying to focus our efforts, because there's a sweet spot with soybeans. Corn, typically, it's straight line. More canopy we have, as long as we've got sufficient nutrients and moisture, our yield just keeps going up, and if we can keep it standing. Soybeans has a little bit of a sweet spot. We can get too much canopy, particularly if it's vegetative growth. What we're after in this canopy management is to try to encourage and set the plant up so that it maximizes the amount of nodal growth, where the flowers and pods are, versus the internode and excess leaf or foliage. It's amazing what that soybean plant will do in that sweet spot, so to speak. And so canopy management, again, as I say, is an interesting area where further study would benefit the industry.
I want to talk a little bit about, before we wrap up, about precision ag. And you had it's an interesting perspective about, you said, precision ag was made for soybeans.
I did.
And I think the point I took away from it was, obviously we're managing zones, we're managing fields, but you basically said, what we're learning with precision ag and soybeans is managing high and low. The middle is tough.
So, again, in life, trying to keep things simple, and precision ag, there's been a lot of work done on corn. Coming on soybeans now as an industry, we're focused on it. But what the tricky part is right away is to describe or quantify those parts of the field zones that are high, mid, and low. And our research work at Syngenta is clearly showing that, distinct high, we've got low, and the mid gets a little tricky, but on average, those zones perform more like the high yield zones.
Yeah.
So we could squeeze it into two, high, mid, and low, but there is a drastic difference between high and low, and they must be managed differently. Could be variety, but certainly in population and even canopy management or row width. And so precision ag has tremendous opportunity to enhance yield and profit for soybean growers.
Hey, to wrap it up, you wrap up your presentations with, if you believe and you want to chase 80 or whatever the number is,
Yes.
Genetics plus environment plus management. That's what you
Genetics by environment by management. Or GEM.
GEM.
Yeah, G by E by M. We used to talk G by E, but it is really exciting now for growers in our industry with soybeans to look at the M component. There are things that you only dreamed of 20 and 30 years ago that our younger producers and guys and gals can do. It's feasible, and the world's their oyster.
Well, were you all taking notes as much as I was? Or did you
80
go
bushel
There
soybeans.
was some, there was some
Okay, so
excellent
I have-
information there for sure.
Okay, good. So and definitely I would say I've got a couple questions that came out of that. One, I want to say, I'm going to start with you, Horst. He refers to soybeans as being thought of as the scavenger crop, and it fixes its own end, just leave it alone. When do you think we shifted that thinking on soybeans in Ontario, or have we yet?
Well, the challenge is, of course, that, and Eric hinted at this as well, that you can't fertilize your way to a big soybean crop. In other words, in the year of, if you just throw down a whole bunch of phosphorus and potassium, and even nitrogen for that matter, we don't get the kind of yield response that we would hope to get. Like, if the soil test is low, there is 5 bushels there in our trials, for sure. If the soil test is low for P and K and you throw on fertilizer, there is a response, no question. But if your soil test is in a reasonable place and you throw on additional fertilizer, we don't see much. And so that's why there is truth to the fact that soybeans are a scavenger, or you can word it differently, that they just cannot take advantage of fertilizer thrown on the year up. So has the thinking changed? I think it has, in the sense that we realize a big crop also needs lots of nutrients, but what hasn't changed so much is maybe our thinking of when to put it down.
Right, and we're going to get to that in a moment because that's a big one. So I wanted to go to you, Dennis, though. Do you think in these discussions this is Ontario Waste talking about that theoretical 80. What is Manitoba's pie in the sky number if Ontario is 80?
Well, it's interesting because one of our best years that we had in soybean production in Manitoba, which had the highest provincial yield, was 2016. And in 2016, we hit 42. That's provincially what we saw. Now, that year, there were some 50 bushel yields. And, even in this year, in certain pockets, you had growers that were saying 60 bushels. I had a little closer look at the yields that year in 2016. And what I did find, looking at all the different RMs, was that where there was that 50 plus bushel range, that it was almost a combination of all the factors going right. You had the right variety growing in the right area, you had the right amount of rainfall and the right amount of heat. All those factors kind of contributed to those high numbers. So theoretically could we do 60 bushels in Manitoba? Yes, on certain fields, but over a widespread growers, it's a little challenging with the varieties because we just don't grow the longer season ones that they do in Ontario. So if I had to put a number on it, I would say 60 as a pie in the sky number, maybe a little bit higher. But after what I saw this year, definitely we're in that 40 to 50 range if we have good growing conditions.
And I will tell you that some of my friends here in Ontario that I've made don't believe me that Manitoba can grow those kinds of soybeans. So I will show them this video and say, ha, so there. Now, I do want to, Eric brings up another good point, I think, about the space and emergence. So we talk about this all the time in corn, of course, right? In that they have to be perfectly spaced and emerge at the same time. How much is or is that not a factor with soybeans, Horst, that you've seen?
Right. So we've done a number of studies over the years to try and assess that. And there is something to what Eric is saying, especially if you're using a row unit planter and you're trying to minimize the number of plants per acre, right? And so the spacing becomes far more important when you are closer to that 100,000 plants per acre as opposed to 200,000. So in our trials, it really separates, the importance of having perfect spacing separates very clearly. At 50,000 plants, it's extremely important. At 200,000 plants, it's not important at all. And the way to think about that is, of course, at 200,000 plants, you've got so many plants that they're just able to fill the canopy anyway, right? So is it important? Yes, no question, but it's not as important as it is for corn. That's how I would say our trials have turned out. There is something neat that happens. If you put 2 or 3 seeds in the same hole, as some drills, of course, do as you're rapidly going down the field, only 1, maybe 2 out of 3 produce much yield. The other one actually basically dies off. We call it attrition, and there's good evidence that the final population of a field actually kind of balances out regardless of your seeding rate. There's this kind of compensation factor, even not just within individual plants, but they actually kill each other out.
They sound like lovely creatures. Really. Now, Dennis, I mean, Manitoba's been growing soybeans for quite some time, though, it's had some ups and downs in the rotation, but certainly gained a lot of acres in the last 10 years, let's say. Do you think that Manitoba growers and just the soybean industry in general, do you think you get to sort of start ahead of the curve because of where we're at with genetics and the research and all that, or did we have to start at zero?
Well, I wouldn't say we started at zero, but in the year 2000 we had 20,000 acres, and in the year 2000 those 20,000 acres were all conventional soybeans, and the varieties that we were growing at that time were the McCalls, the Glaciers, all those varieties that really weren't quite suited for Manitoba, but we could kind of grow them in the south. But then once we started hitting our stride in the mid 2000s, then we started to see better genetics and genetics that were developed for Manitoba. And that's when our yield started increasing, because now we were able to pick and choose a variety for your growing region. So if you're growing beans south of Winnipeg, you could grow a long season variety. But if you're growing beans north of Winnipeg, you'd want to look at an early to mid season line. So I think that really brought things along. And the ability to control weeds in the field is probably the biggest thing why our yields went up as well. If you can keep those beans clean early, and you can't do that in the glyphosate system, that makes a huge difference in your overall yield. And also, too, if you do have thinner stands, I've seen growers that have had reduced stands down to 50,000 plants per acre, but were able to keep it clean for the whole growing season and still put out 42 bushels an acre. And that was on in actual. That wasn't just grower conversations. That was actually recorded yields on those fields. But you just have to keep them clean. So,
okay, so we've got plenty of questions coming in, which I thought would happen as soon as we hit on the fertility discussion. So I do want to bring up a few now. So Jason Vogt's got a few here. One of them is getting soybeans to put on a lot of vegetative growth during the longest days to get more nodes. Nodes are what drives yield, is what I think I've heard from Eric before. So with our short growing season, Dennis, because Jason's out of Manitoba, how key is that in balancing that vegetative growth, those, a productive soil, trying to get that plant to nodulate and feed that yield potential?
Well, I think that's key. And when our industry is maturing a little bit now in Manitoba compared to what it was maybe 10 years ago. What we're seeing now is we're seeing fields with a history of of soybeans on them, and we're seeing better nodulation in those fields. But it's still very key. And I've seen instances where fields have been out of soybeans for 4 to 5 years. Growers are, using rhizobium bacteria, but they're only using, let's say, one form of it, like a liquid on seed, and we're not getting the bacteria numbers. And the yields have suffered in those cases as well. Once we have a bit of history, plus the combination of using a liquid and a granular inoculant to make sure you have the bacteria numbers there to get that nodulation and to get the nodules functioning, that's the key. You can have 10 nodules, but if they're white inside not doing their job, that's not good. I've seen fields with 5 or 6 nodules that are nice and pink that have yielded well. So I think just getting that under control in Manitoba, and especially with our colder soils in spring, can be a bit of a challenge.
All right, I want to come back to nitrogen because there's always the question: do I put down nitrogen, at planting or at seeding or not? But first, from Shawridge Farms, so question out of Ontario here: what are your thoughts on sulfur responses, Horst?
Yeah, again, sulfur is one of those critical elements that we know plants need. And yet when we do the trials in soybeans, so we have about 20 trials now over the last few years, so not a full data set by any stretch, but we do have some indication of what's going on. And the response has been kind of disappointing again. Out of those 20, I think I have 3 where I have a statistical response, right, to up to 20 pounds of actual sulfur in the springtime. So I think there will come a day when we have to apply sulfur as the soil is depleted further and further. But it's certainly not like we're missing 5 bushels in the average Ontario field. I am completely confident of that statement. But are we missing 1 or 2 bushels in some fields? Yes. In 2020, I put down 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate up front, and we did get 3 bushels out of that across a few sites. I think it was 4 sites. So there is something to be said about it. Am I super excited? I think it's going to disappoint us again in the end, unfortunately.
All right, so now we've got, we're going to get excited about it. We are. One of these nutrients is going to be the magic bullet that just, you slap it on there and we get 80 bushels, no problem. Okay, we do have a question coming in on the text line from Wayne. I agree to a point that when you put fertilizer down the year of the soybean crop, there's little to no response depending on the soil test. Have you seen a response when you change the source of the lagging fertility? So we're starting to get into sort of different products like K-Mag, or sulfate of potassium, that sort of stuff. So some perhaps different products.
So I mean, let me try and answer the question this way. I am 100% convinced that the difference between a 50 bushel crop and a 100 bushel crop is not just water in August and crop heat units like we used to say, right? I mean, we used to just basically say that the reason we can't get big crops is because our growing season is too short and we don't get enough water in the critical period. And that is usually in August. And I really don't think that's the limiting factor. And we know that because some years we can have 80, 90, even almost 100 bushels here in Ontario in small areas, right? So I don't want to exaggerate, in small areas. And we know that the soil in those areas is much richer, especially for P and K. So all that to say is, no question, soybeans need a lot of nutrients. Are there forms of both P and K that are maybe a little more available, better balance, less likely to burn early on? Because that is also one of the issues we have, right? Most of soybean roots are in the top 3 inches. And of course, as things dry out there, you just can't take up the nutrients that you've put down. So yeah, I mean, I've had some more luck with something like maize that has more nutrients in it, including some sulfur, some zinc, and we went with 50% K-Mag, and we are getting a little bit more out of that than straight potash and MAP. So I think that it's a combination of adding more nutrients to the package and not just the form, right? But I mean, I see one of the things what you gotta think about though here is when you're struggling to get 3, 4, maybe 5 bushels in a low testing environment, right? To then differentiate between something that gives you 3 bushels and something that gives you 5 bushels from a scientific standpoint is very difficult to do. You need 100 trials, almost, that kind of thing, to really have confidence, right? And then you do a whole bunch of trials and there's no response anyway to anything you did. So then you kind of say, well, that was not our limiting factor. There was another issue in that set of trials. So that's one of the challenges.
Mhm. I do want to switch gears a little bit here, Dennis, because you have sent we've got a map of my home province, Manitoba. So thank you. But the question from Nate Ort here is, what are the biggest yield limiting factors in your province, and what can growers do to address it? So I'm going to guess that this handy map of Manitoba is going to come into play at least partially because of that.
For sure. Yes. If you want to
Mm.
throw that up on the clip. Now we're looking at a black screen right now. There we go.
There we go. Hey,
There we go.
I'd have to travel from Alberta. It came a long way. All right.
There we go.
So walk us through some of the biggest limiting factors for Manitoba.
Well, I guess one of the limiting factors, I guess, is still in some respects maturity. When you look at this map and you look at, the red zone, which is a long season area, that's where we're growing, the longer season beans in that 2450, 2500, 2550 range. Those beans can reach full maturity when you're given good moisture during the growing season. As you kind of spread out into those areas and you go up towards, the western and northwestern corners of Manitoba, that's the dark green regions, there you're looking at those early season varieties. And there's a reason why this map was put together, because growers are always asking questions about, where do all these soybean varieties, how do they match up with the different zones? So this map is based on long-term heat units as well as frost feed periods. So it takes all those factors in. So I'd mentioned earlier about 2016 showing some very strong yields in Manitoba, our highest yields that we've ever seen. When I start looking at each individual municipality and I see, a 50 plus bushel soybean in that particular municipality, I automatically look at where it is in Manitoba. And usually what ends up happening is if it's in the southern part of Manitoba, the variety is usually a long season variety. If it's kind of in the western side of the province and it's hitting that 50 plus mark, it's usually something that's very well suited for that growing region. Where the varieties that are like longer, when you're throwing it into the west, just don't perform as well. You gotta, but by the same token, if you're on the really extreme end, where you're looking at real triple zero early maturing varieties, you do give up some yield when you're putting it into a long or mid-season zone. So those are some of the factors you really kind of need to kind of keep in mind when you're picking varieties. So,
all right. That actually is a wonderful segue to our second video clip. Now this one Horst, you may recognize the gentleman in this clip because it's you. So we're going to head to the soybean school. This one was filmed back in May of 2020, back when we thought COVID would be over in the summer. But also we had a very cool spring last year in Ontario. So we are going to just take a couple minutes for this clip, and then we'll join back here because we've got some follow-up work from this work that you did. So we'll head to clip number 2 now.
I want to talk about planting into cool soils. It's May 5th. Pretty cool. We've got some weather coming.
Yeah.
And you've been talking about this for a bit. Before we get to I guess, the situation right now, I want to talk about what you're learning here already about planting into cool soils. Tell us about some stuff you're digging up here.
Right. So there's been some conversation over the years that if you plant really early, you should maybe even plant your soybeans a little deeper for more consistent temperatures, as opposed to shallow, which is what I believe is the right thing to do if you're planting very early, right? Because of course we want to see those beans emerge again, and we've talked about that. So what we have here is different planting depths: 1 inch, 1.5, 2, 2.5. And we planted those on April 22nd, right? So 2 weeks tomorrow. And from what you can see, they are coming along very nicely, right? They've got a nice little radical on there, so things look fairly good, despite the fact that when I planted those, it was 3 degrees Celsius, right? And it went to -2 that night. So really shocked them. But I think the key to soil temperatures is whether or not the ground is fit and relatively dry. So what I'm getting at, I'm quite sure that if the last 2 weeks had been soaking and the ground was saturated, right, those beans would look ugly, right? Because they start to rot if it's wet. They can handle dry, relatively dry conditions and it being cold. What soybeans really don't like is wet conditions.
Right. Now, it's May 5th, it's cool.
Right.
And so what I'm hearing from you is saying is drive on. But beware of those wet conditions, and we may have some wet conditions coming this weekend.
Right, absolutely. So, the scenario, of course, of cold soils is far from ideal. We want it warm, but you weigh the risk and you say, here we are in May, it's Ontario, the ground is fit in a lot of places. Do you drive or do you not drive? And my theory is you should not let a window pass. If the ground is fit, that's the key, right? The ground has to be fit. You can plant as long as there's not a big, cold, heavy shower coming or rain event. And of course, there's a few reasons for that. One is we can get crusting, and we know that's such a problem for soybeans. Number 2 is you can get that imbibitional chilling injury, that shock of that initial cold water within the first 24 hours or so. That's what we really want to avoid, right? So planting into cold soils, we don't seem to get that shock, but if you get that cold rain after, that can be a real problem, right?
Yeah. So it's Tuesday. You said
Right.
you're going to drive on with your planting your plots until Thursday, and at that time you're going to make a call.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. In my estimation, it's far from ideal. Again, I'd like it to be 25 degrees here today, but I've got my jacket on. It's about 10 right now. Tomorrow it's going to 13. I'm comfortable with that. I'm going to plant, and you know what? Those beans will be just fine, but they're calling for some showers, maybe some snow on the weekend. So I'm going to stop Thursday and then reassess, right, to see what happens. Now, you might say, well, why not just wait till next week, right? It's supposed to get warmer. Well, the only reason is because in Ontario, you never know if you're going to get a window next week or next month, right, like we learned last week. So this is really about weighing the risks. And yeah, there's some risk, but it's really not that big a deal and you can see just even from that picture that we showed, right, of the little radical on the seed. Of course, we don't have a plant stand count yet, but they look fine, and we've done it in the past, and it works out.
So Horst, 2020, how did it end up?
Well, it actually turned out incredibly well in terms of the overall yield with respect to those plant stands, right? We did have some reduced plant stands, but overall, those beans yielded very well. And we can show some results here if you want to go to the first slide. And we'll just take a quick look at that. Basically, we won't take too much time to really assess this. We had 3 dates, and what you can see is even though we seeded 175,000 seeds, we only ended up with somewhere between 95 and 165,000. But the point is, for the first 2 planting dates, at 2 inches and certainly at 2.5 inches, we started to have significantly reduced stands. But it was only at 2.5 inches for the later date, which makes sense, right? Conditions were warmer then. But if you go to the next slide here, I think this is where it gets really interesting in terms of, soybeans just don't care that much about the overall final stand. The thing that matters to us, of course, is the yield. And if you look at the average across those different depths, now we're just talking depths, we'll talk about the dates of themselves in a minute. But, you know, there's a clear drop off there at 2 inches and at 2.5 inches on average. Now, again, the June 10th date, it was the same for the 2 inches. But my overall point is, you know, this conversation of planting soybeans a little deeper, I just don't think we have any good evidence for that, and we're going to do this a few more years and see if it holds up every year. If you go to the next slide real quick, we'll assess the impact of that cold soil and planting on both stands and yield. So April 22nd, right, real cold. Then just a couple of days later, it warmed up, and then it warmed up a little more yet. Yet, having said that, all those dates did not yield better than the May 22nd, a more normal window. And I was a little bit disappointed in the sense that, you know, for years we've been so excited about planting soybeans early and earlier and earlier to get higher and higher yields, because there is sometimes a few bushels to planting even into April. But you can see from the numbers there, not in my trials in 2020, that's for sure. But the other way to look at it is there was also no reduction, right? So if you're planting winter wheat or something, if you can get those beans in early, you'll also harvest them earlier. So overall, I think personally, I'm kind of over the soil temperature thing. And I know that Dennis showed it in that graph at the beginning, that visual. I would even kick that out, to be honest. I don't even care about soil temperature anymore if the ground is dry. If the ground is wet, totally different story.
You heard it here first, folks. Okay, so one follow-up before I go to Dennis. Peter Johnson, some guy in Ontario, wants to know, Horst, what about maturity on those different planting dates? Did that make a difference?
Oh, Peter, you just can't get away from me.
You're supposed to focus on Tell him.
Awesome. Good that you're on, Peter. And you hit on a very good point. You know, absolutely. And I think this is what Peter really is getting at. He knows the answer, but he's trying to steer us to plant more winter wheat. So good on you, Pete. You just never give up, do you? Anyway, yeah, if you plant those beans earlier, you can get them off earlier. No question about that, right? It's not a straightforward linear relationship. Each day you plant earlier, you can also harvest a day earlier. But there is no question a relationship. So, you know, the overall message, if you plant 3 days later in the spring, it correlates to about 1 day later harvest in the fall, or the other way around if you want. But no question, those April beans, you know, that were planted earlier, and even though they took a long time to get out of the ground, we did manage to cut those faster in the fall, right?
Absolutely. Okay, so we move though to Manitoba, where winter wheat usually follows canola, but not always. When we are talking, Dennis, about, of course, that very short window at times for getting soybeans in the ground, what do the Manitoba numbers say for early versus soil temp versus calendar?
Well, I guess the biggest thing for us, we're usually planting in that full-blown planting in that 2nd to 3rd week of May, typically every year. There are soybeans planted in early May, and generally they work out okay, but it's also unlimited acres. It's, as Horst said, and I really like this comment, as long as the soil is fit. Because I've seen growers, you know, it's May 1st and they're done everything and they want to get planting, and they're calling for some cool weather, and they put the soybeans in May 1st. And on May 28th, I get a phone call saying, why aren't my soybeans coming up yet? Well, you planted May 1st. The soil temperature thing does play into the decision. Do I always tell growers to wait to 10 degrees? No. It has to do with how many acres you have to go in the ground, what the weather's like. And like I say, in Manitoba, on a number of years, we're always in that cool, wet soil, not necessarily the cool, dry soil. So that does make a difference as well. But ideally, you know, getting the beans in that 2nd to 3rd week of May, And again, you got to look at your risk profile. If you're planting a few thousand acres, you got to spread that out a little bit. You don't want to plant all your 2,000 acres on May 1st. So if you're starting May 5th or in that range and you're spreading it out over a week or so, then you're spreading out your risk a little bit more. So that's kind of what the Manitoba growers tend to do.
Now, I know we talk a lot about, in Ontario, we start to talk about, as the season wears on, if we've had a really tough planting season, you might be swapping out corn heat units. Dennis, does that same discussion happen on the soybean side in the maturity range if we've got a really late year?
If you pick your variety in February and you're picking a variety according to your maturity zone, you're generally not going to be changing. Our window is pretty short, even shorter than in Ontario. We're typically not planting. We try not to plant in June, especially in the western side of the province. You want to get them in May. So I get this question every year. It's getting close to May 25th, and growers are asking the question, well, should I be changing? And it's mostly in the growers in the west. But if you pick the right variety in the winter months, you're going to be just fine. Once you start getting into June, all bets are off. Things change. There, you might have an advantage. Some of the research that's been done in Manitoba has shown, switching to a earlier season variety once you get into that June time period. But in Manitoba, you have to be very, very careful as a grower where you are in the province and whether or not you'll have crop insurance if you start planting in June, because some areas they cut off at the end of May. And those are all the factors that kind of play into it. But generally, if you're planting in May and you pick the right variety during the winter months, you should be just fine.
Okay, there you have it. Okay, so I cannot believe how quickly this hour is going by. I know that we could probably we could go back to fertility for another hour, but we want to bring in one more factor in talking about getting the soybean crop off to a really strong start, and that, of course, is going to be weed control. So we are going to go now to our third clip with Dr. Clarence Swanton, and perhaps we'll also recognize the other person in this one, as he was just in the comments. Let's go to that clip now.
The issue they have, the critical period is still highly relevant, okay? It still is a guideline for us. But one of the questions we started to ask was, if we looked at our graphs and we realized that once we got into that critical period, we could lose yield, if we waited a little bit too long past that threshold of 3 leaf, for example, things were happening very fast in the plant. So we started to look at what was happening very early at the seedling stage when the weeds were present, okay? And what we find is that a lot of stuff is happening in the cellular level. So the plants are beginning to communicate, which is a neat thing to think about. You need to think about a corn plant or a soybean plant being like a computer chipboard that is constantly reading its environment. For example, we've just about to release some work where we show that as a soybean plant is coming up through the ground, as it gets near the surface of the ground, it begins to know whether there's green tissue on the top of that surface. And it picks up the signal through the pores of the soil and actually changes its morphology before it even emerges out of the ground. When it's in the hypocotyl stage of the soybean plant, wow, it's already changed because of the presence of above ground weeds. So it's the speed at which some of these things are changing. This is some of the new things that we're finding, that the plants are actually communicating, they're reading their environment, and they're actually changing their physiology and their morphology. So our original critical period was based around when we could detect yield differences. Now we're looking at the cell level of the plant, and we're able to see some of these changes happening very early on. Now the question is, even though this is happening early, can the plant compensate for it, okay? So that's one of the concerns, issues that we have. The plant has to repair some of those damages. So right now our data says that very early on, prior to even the beginning of that critical period, we're starting to detect physiological changes. And so that argues well for the fact of, start clean and stay clean, and provides the science behind that recommendation.
So what we'd really like to do then is get back into more soil-applied herbicides, make sure that we had the weeds dead at that point, and then, so now I want to plant a cover crop after. If the corn gets big enough, the soybeans get big enough, do late emerging weeds still play, or does the end of that critical weed-free period still come into play where I can plant those cover crops?
Yeah, I think in terms of planting cover crops, you want to use the critical period concept. And that I would use that as my guideline. And we certainly know in the work that we have done, the most consistent part of the critical period was the ending of the critical period. The rest of it's like an accordion, because depending on the field, on the environment, on the weed pressure, things can begin a little bit earlier. Mind you, we were very conservative on our estimates, but it is, it is just a guideline. But I think in terms of cover crops, there's some real potential to use that critical period as your guideline for planting. When a plant comes up out of the ground, it should only see its own siblings. Okay, it should only see corn plants. We know that if the weed emerges at the same time as the corn plant, the plant detects that, and it starts to change its physiology in response. So start clean, stay clean is a very good beginning, and use that end of the critical period, so that's the time frame I really still need to focus on good weed management.
Yeah, so start clean means that before the crop comes up, we have everything dead. Stay clean till the end of that critical weed-free period, which is still probably in that 6 to 8 leaf stage of corn, that 2 to 3 leaf trifoliate stage of soybeans, so cool. So last question then, in terms of glyphosate, I'm out there, I spray my glyphosate. We know that glyphosate is a very slow kill. Once I spray the glyphosate, the weed's dead, I'm good, or how does that play out?
Well, that's an interesting point, because when you've made the effort to spray your field and you're leaving the field, you're feeling like the weed control work is all done, right? And what our work is suggesting is that we know that if the weeds are present, the plants are able to detect those weeds, and we know that the longer the weed stays green, the plants continue to get that signal from the weed. And with glyphosate takes 10 days to brown out a weed. And so even though you've sprayed today, the impact of that weed is still being felt through signaling on the actual crop plant itself. So the longer it takes to die, the more impact it still has on the crop seedling.
I'm just going to say it. Plants are super cool. And I have livestock, so I'm allowed to say that. Okay, so I could listen to Clarence talk about the secret life of plants for a long time, but there's a few things that come out of this, and one question popped up while we were watching that. And so this is also from Shawridge Farms, says, early planting with slow emergence while using pre-emerge herbicide products, are there concerns with vigor? So Horst, I'll go to you, as Shawridge is in Ontario.
Yeah, generally we don't have big problems with that. I know what he's getting at, right? That the seed is in the ground longer, you'll have more uptake. Typically, the biggest problem is if the seedling is just breaking through, and then we get a big shower and a big kind of flush of chemicals into that early developing seed. So I guess I would say I haven't seen that. I haven't seen a significant problem in terms of the April versus May planted beans with respect to herbicide tolerance.
Okay. Now, Dennis, I have a question. So we're talking about, of course, getting this field burned off, getting that crop in the ground, keeping it clean. So Manitoba, on one hand, you're not getting in there till a little bit later, so that should give you a chance to get across that field for a burn down. Or do farmers get tripped up because they're so busy with seeding everything, and the busy seeding season, do those fields get missed? How do most farmers in Manitoba tackle this?
Well, I don't know if the fields were per se get missed, but what may end up happening is, let's say you're trying to do a spring burn off in early May. Your soil temperatures are like the overall temperatures are cool, and you're not getting maybe the contact and the kill that you'd like to see. I guess I'm of the opinion, and I've cut my teeth on dry beans, and where you look at something like that where you need to keep the crop clean right from day one. And I've always taken the same approach in soybeans, keeping them clean right from day one. So if you're having some weed challenges, that let's say you have some resistant challenges, there are some options that you can go in, whether you're using an extend system or whether you're using, let's say you're using conventional beans and you want to use some edge in that mix, or even just a burn down in spring. But I think the important thing is you have to know what your weed spectrum is on the field and treat that field. If you have a problem, you got to treat it the right way, right from the get-go. Because if you're chasing weeds, that's going to hurt your yield potential. So those, I think for the most part, I think growers are on top of it. But what sometimes may play into it is that, growers want to get the field planted, but we've had, last spring is a perfect example. We had 3 windy days in a row of 80 kilometers an hour. How do you spray in 80 kilometer an hour winds? So sometimes that's where a lot of times I see weed challenges, is where growers can't get in due to the weather. So.
Now, this is where our time's just about done here, and we haven't really talked about inoculant. We talked a little bit about fertility, but maybe not nearly as much as we could have. One thing I don't want to leave without talking about, somewhat anyway, is if you've done your best to pick your variety, you've done your best at planting or seeding, you've got it into a good window when the soil was fit, when should we be assessing the job that we did? Beginning when in the season? I'll start with you, Horst.
Well, I think you never really stop assessing, right? I mean, in some places like Eastern Europe, they do everything by the calendar, right? So many days after you've seeded, you spray. And then the week later, you come back and you spray again, and so on, right? They have it down like some of the vegetable people. They don't care about assessing anything. They just work at it based on the calendar. And there are problems with that with respect to IPM. I'm not saying that we want to go down that road, but overall, I would say, that early weed control, I think we've really improved in our thinking, because when Roundup first was introduced, of course, it seemed so easy just to let the weeds go and then kill them all, and we learned that wasn't the right thing to do. So I guess I don't really know exactly how to answer your question. Maybe I've got too much time in my hands, but I go back all the time, and it's amazing how fast things change in this as the soybean develops, right?
All right, Dennis, when do you head out there and do a stand assessment? When do you start?
Well, I guess if there's a couple things you need to consider. If you're looking at stand assessment, I think the one thing that sometimes gets missed by growers is, how good a job they did seeding. If you spend the money on the seed and you spend the money on the fancy equipment to get the beans in the ground, and you get them in the ground, you seed them, and then you don't look at them until until like, let's say, a month and a half later, when it comes time to start spraying. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but usually I like to be in the field about 30 days after planting to do a stand assessment to know whether or not I'm hitting my targets. If I'm targeting 140,000 plants and I only end up with 50, I better figure out what's going on, and whether it's a seed issue, seed quality issue, or there are mechanical issues. That's the first time I like to get in there. So generally 3 weeks after planting, or I guess maybe 3 weeks after emergence. But really, if you have a problem with weeds, you're going to be needing to be in there a little sooner. But that's probably the first time I'd really like to kind of be in there once the crop's all up, and just to get your standard establishment and to know what you have.
Absolutely. All right, Horst, anything to add on that one?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about the stand establishment is that often, we don't have them all up for at least 30 days. So Dennis is right on. We don't do our final stand counts until 30 days after seeding, right? And sometimes it takes even longer, but we just ignore the last ones. Somewhere before the end of May, you should have a pretty good idea, so that you can replant in a timely fashion if the plants were stressed for some reason and didn't come up. I guess, as we kind of wrap up this session, I mean, one thing that's on my mind that we haven't hit on maybe enough, and Dennis hit on it to some extent, but back to this idea of what I would just call basic agronomy, in the sense that each farm, each region really is quite different. And the biggest help that I think, people like Dennis and myself can give to the individual grower is to say, figure out the number one yield limiting factor in your field and address it. And you'd be surprised how often that'll take you not 1 or 2 bushels ahead, but maybe 3 or 4, right? And that could be something as simple as low potassium. It might be soil drainage. It might be the right variety, whatever it is. I mean, but like sometimes we give these talks and we make it sound like you have to figure out everything to get a good crop. No, in your specific situation, I'm surprised sometimes how simple the problem is if it's just addressed properly. And you know what? If you have to, hire somebody and get some help to figure out what that problem is. And this is not I'm not looking for a job. I'm just saying there is some help out there, right?
I feel like you're probably busy enough, Horst. Seriously. But it is a great point. I want to wrap up there in that you've given all our agronomists watching and all of our growers watching, you've given them their homework. That's the one thing to ask of each of their soybean fields this year is what's that number one limiting factor, and is there something you can do this year to address it? And if not, maybe by next year. So with that, Horst Bohner, Dennis Lange, thanks so much for joining us on The Agronomists. Everyone watching along, please head over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow. This episode will be up, as will the forms. You can apply for your credits. Don't forget those. So thank you so much to Dennis and to Horst. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you for all your knowledge and for sharing your time with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a great night, everyone.
All right. And thanks to all of you watching on Twitter and YouTube. Apparently Facebook didn't work, but we'll fix that at some point, I'm sure. This has been a great time. Thanks so much for all your questions, all your interactions. Kara was keeping tabs of who was asking questions, and she'll be mailing out some hats, or we'll find someone who will, I'm sure. As always, as I mentioned, you can head over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. You can find past episodes of the show. You can find the button there to apply for your credits. And of course, you can sign up for an email blast to remind you of when the show airs and when to sign up for your CEU credits. And hey, if you do like shows like this one, we also run live weekdays at 3 p.m. Eastern on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and also Twitch, which I don't actually know what it is, but that's because I'm getting up there in age. Anyway, tomorrow's guest is John Drieger with Left Field Commodities. So if you're into the whole grain market talk, don't miss that one. I believe Kara Oosterhuis is hosting that as well, because apparently we just ask her to do everything. Anyway, thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you again soon.